Hello, my name is Duncan McAfee, and today is Friday the 15th of November 2024. I am here in my studio near Brixton in southeast London, UK, where I live and work, making paintings and drawings, exploring figurative abstraction on the outskirts of fine art, pop art and cartooning. I was born in the UK in the London satellite town of Hertford, and grew up between the suburbs and the countryside, living in a relatively isolated village. I was a bit of a dreamy kid who found it difficult to concentrate at school, unless it was something I was particularly interested in, like art, and I ended up spending a fair amount of time being sent out of class. I can still remember sitting under a particular set of stairs outside the headmaster's office, not really doing the work that I'd been set. I think, like a lot of artists, I've always felt like a bit of an outsider, like I didn't really fit in. Maybe this was partly due to my upbringing. I was with my mother and two younger brothers, and a rather absent and complex father who was an alcoholic, prone to what would now be diagnosed as manic depression. Something of an enigma to me, mostly out or sort of passing through the house with occasional bursts of energy and enthusiasm that would be hard to understand and would just as quickly disappear. As a result of the situation at home, I was encouraged to apply for a boarding school, Christ Hospital in Sussex, and surprised everyone by somehow passing the exams. So I moved out of home when I was 11, and it was quite challenging. I wasn't a particularly confident child, so I got picked on quite a lot. And the following year, when I was 12, my father committed suicide. I took solace in the art school and found that's sort of where I belonged, really. I could draw quite well, and the head of art sort of took me under his wing and helped nurture me in my work over the years. I found myself and my voice through art while I was at school. I think my current work still has elements of making sense of this sort of confusing environment that I grew up in. I moved back to Hertford in 1994 and started at the University of Hertfordshire for my Art Foundation degree. I was already certain I was going to be a painter, but rather than apply for university straight afterwards, I quickly realised that I needed more experience of the world first. So I applied for a voluntary position in London the following year, and I was placed to work as a personal assistant with my now still good friend John Kelly. He's a youth worker, educator, artist, musician, and disability activist and disability equality trainer. So this had a huge impact on me and introduced me to all kinds of new people, political ideas about disability, and I had my first experiences of working in educational settings. I had a second year out where I moved back home but lived with my grandmother who was developing dementia, and helped her out whilst I built up more of a painting portfolio. And I applied successfully for a painting degree at Chelsea College of Art. This was a fantastic place. Being the late 90s, though, the attitude towards painting was generally a bit negative. So I ended up experimenting with all kinds of other approaches to making work, from process-led art to performance, sculpture, making books, and sound and music, which was where I ended up focusing my work for quite a long time after. Following my art degree, I did a postgraduate certificate in education and worked in and around schools and colleges teaching art for about 15 years after that, first as a classroom teacher and then later as a freelance project-based artist. This was always part-time, and I made work and undertook public commissions alongside this, which was reliant on public funding that became harder and harder to find. And shortly after my second child was born, I took a bit of a break and ended up being a stay-at-home parent for a few years, keeping studio practice bubbling away in the background and slowly returning back to collages, drawing and painting. Which brings us up to the current day. Most recently, as my children have become more independent, my studio practice has focused primarily on painting, and I've had more time. So between 2021 and 23, I did a 2-year course with Turps Art School on their off-site course, which was a great way to re-engage with my practice properly and reconnect with the London art scene. And things have picked up pretty quickly in the last few years with I've had solo exhibitions in London with Ben Oakley Gallery, in Suffolk with 303 Projects, worked with Kyle Mark's project in Canada and Calgary, and shown at the London Art Fair. And I'm currently working with Castle Fine Art, showing work with them across the UK. I think these experiences growing up have an impact on my work still today. I'm depicting a strange, wild, unpredictable world of people, and maybe there's an element of escapism to this, but on another level it's sort of through being a step removed you can be more brutally honest, in the same way that satirical or political cartoons have a sort of directness that you can't do in other ways. The cartoon violence and disjointedness of my characters in the paintings might have started out drawing from personal experiences of alcohol and emotional instability, but I think they've become more and more about the current state of the world. I feel like if you're not sort of confused and exasperated by what's going on pretty much everywhere at the moment, you're probably not paying attention. My school also has had a lasting impact. It was a religious school, which, I certainly wasn't seduced by Christianity, but I'd say I found it baffling and alienating, but I should think it probably had the inverse effect that it intended, of making me deeply suspicious of any institutions and very resistant to being told what to do. But having said this, it did give me some material to work with, and I still like using or referring to religious stories or imagery in my work. For example, I painted a 5-metre wide version of Leonardo's Last Supper, which is now in a private collection, and various versions of Pentecost paintings, looking at historical examples from Duccio to El Greco to Titian. Religious imagery is a key part of Western art history, so it's hard to avoid, but I'm particularly fascinated by the way Rembrandt in particular embodies and humanises his characters, particularly the prophet Paul, who he became obsessed with. My biggest influences probably stem from loving cartoons as a child, the madness and mayhem of the New Adventures of Mighty Mouse in the 80s, which was heavily influential on things like Ren and Stimpy later on. I worked out later in life that the Mighty Mouse director, Ralph Bakshi, had also made animated films for adults, such as the wonderfully flawed film Cool World, with its incredible range of animated characters all crammed together, from talking babies to mobsters and femme fatales to anthropomorphic cars and puffed up superheroes. I love the exciting and confusing all too muchness of it. I draw a lot from contemporary and historical painting too. I particularly love Chaim Soutin's awkward bellboys and chefs and their tortured humanity. My first and biggest influence as a painter, though, must be Francis Bacon, and I still remember seeing his writhing portraits smeared across the canvases when I was 15 or 16 years old on a trip up to London with school, and being astonished at how these seemingly random smudges, scrapes and spatters managed to take on the likeness of his sitters so convincingly. Contemporary painting, like George Condo, I love his lyrical use of line, and his concept of psychological cubism has also kind of seeped into work that I've made. And I love that kind of art historical line from Picasso through Francis Bacon to Condo as a kind of art historical lineage. My current work is developing along a few different strands at the moment. I'm making a body of portrait-based paintings, which divides roughly into 2 groups. The first is a growing series of heads based on a range of my friends and colleagues, which have been evolving over the course of this year. And I'm also doing a group of full-body figures, which are based on an artist character who is basically a self-portrait. These all portray the artist in sort of contorted poses, pushing against the edge of the image frame, and often in the middle of some kind of mishap, like a dropped paintbrush or a falling canvas, or having run out of ideas or got distracted by something. And this series is me kind of dealing with the ridiculousness of being a painter, sifting through the detritus of the studio in a sort of Guston-esque way, but to my mind playing with more contemporary issues, maybe around masculinity, sexuality and the body in a post-AI world. The number of fingers that the characters have, and digits are sort of interchangeable with toes. Sometimes they're more like tentacles or nipples, drawing on the strange sort of abstraction that you get with AI glitches. And I've also been most recently developing relief works, which are built from component parts of cut-out bodies, cardboard, scrap wood, broken frames, and even chopped up old paintings, which are kind of repurposed, mixing up bodily parts and domestic elements to make what I see as sort of lurid, pop, John Carpenter-esque things. I don't think it's a good idea to rely on your art practice to support you, and I'd say it's usually better to keep the two things separate for as long as possible, allowing the work to be for its own sake and to develop without the pressure of being commercial. And this way you're developing something more authentic that is more likely to be spiritually sustaining for you over time. But beyond making a living, which I've only just about started to do from my practice in the past year or so, I'd say discipline is probably the main challenge. I definitely need a routine, and I try to treat my studio like a job, being there during office or school hours, and make sure that I work every day. Holidays can be really disrupting things, so I now have tactics to make sure that I can pick things up quickly again after a break. Like, for instance, I'd cut up a load of components and spread them all over the floor so that I can come back to a mess and start playing with these things when I get back, rather than having to start from scratch. I often talk about my art practice in relationship with Samuel Beckett's play Krapp's Last Tape. For anyone who doesn't know the play, it's a single actor playing an old man who, on what is presumed is his last birthday, is listening back over tape recordings that he's made every year on his birthday. So he's kind of interacting with and talking to past versions of himself. And I think there's something very similar that happens in my paintings. I tend to build them up in layers as though I'm playing a game of consequences with, or perhaps against, myself. Sometimes I spoil what was there so I can come back and fix it another day, painting bits out or obscuring or rubbing back to reveal or blurring or redefining. And then I keep going until it reaches a sort of state of equilibrium, a sort of balance between coming together and falling apart. This conversation is obviously impossible, but I love that impossibility. I love the sort of contradiction of it. If it were possible, I'm not sure I would give any advice. I'm half tempted to say stick to painting and don't waste your 20s and 30s making sound and music. But I think maybe those years were absolutely necessary, and perhaps I needed 20 years of not painting to be able to make the paintings I'm making now. The mediums that I use are not particularly traditional. I've never painted on canvas. The idea seems very alien to me. I prefer to paint on board or more often on paper. I also rarely use any oil paint. I use a lot of Indian ink, which I love for its richness and versatility, but also for its traditionally being used for line work in cartoons and comic books, as well as for tattooing. So I love that sort of democratic resonance that it has. Much of the paint I use is emulsion based, in part so that Indian ink will take to it, which it won't over pure acrylic. But I will also mix in acrylics and acrylic pigments to get some of the rich colours that I need. And I also use various inks, watercolours and even red wine. If I find something that could be used, I will give it a try, whether it's household paint found on the street or out-of-date food colouring from the back of the cupboard at home. Initially, using emulsion and found paint started out as a cost-saving exercise, but over the years I've learnt how they behave in different dilutions and combinations, how they'll soak in or sit on top, run, crack, scrub back, blend, smudge. It's all very particular to the type of paints that I use, and obviously different from things like slow-drying oil paint. I also like the speed and immediacy of emulsion and acrylic. The fact that you do something and it dries quickly, you're sort of stuck with the consequences of what you've done. There's no fiddling around in the way that you do with oil. What I listen to in the studio varies from day to day depending on what I'm doing and how I feel. Some days it will be podcasts, anything from news and current affairs to philosophy. I like that kind of sense of everything going on at the same time and probably feed on being slightly overwhelmed by it all. But other times I'll have music, which might be anything from classical to drum and bass, depending on what works on the day. Having 2 teenage children means I often get the best reactions to my work from them. Sometimes they'll roll their eyes or make jokes or tell me I've gone too far, but often they'll say really insightful things. They've grown up in the world that I'm now trying to make sense of, but to them, obviously, that's normal. This is normal. So when my daughter says she really likes the way something looks like it's glitching, or my son recently said that one of my paintings looked like it was a big lump of doughy flesh trapped in a box, I feel like if they understand the work, then I must be doing something right. I would like people to get a range of things from my work. I want them to feel a bit uncomfortable, perhaps disturbed, but also to see joy and humour in it. I'd like them to think about art and its history, both the history of painted images and the history of that individual painting, the layers of time that are embedded in it. I would like them to think about people, characters, misfits, oddballs, or just other people different from them, but equally human. I don't think my work is overtly political or polemical, but I do want it to communicate something about being human and human relations and connections. So if there is a political message, then I would say that's probably it. So as I record this, it's heading towards the end of 2024, and if you're in London, I'm getting ready for my annual Christmas Open Studios over the weekend of the 6th to 7th of December. That's in Cold Harbour Studios near Brixton. I've also got work coming up in, I think, 3 group shows on the same night, and I'm going to be in a 4-person show through January and February in Moore House, a building near Moorgate in the city. So I've got lots going on, and if you want to keep up to date, do follow me on Instagram. It's at Duncan McAfee, MCAFEE, and you can sign up to my emailing list. There's a link on my website. That's duncanmcafee.com. I hope that's answered all your questions, and thanks very much for having me on the channel.